In 1991, a geneticist named Jacob Ijdo sat in a laboratory at Yale University and stared at a sequence of DNA that should not have existed where he found it. He was looking at human chromosome 2, the second largest strand of genetic code in your body, and buried deep in its centre, far from the ends where they belonged, were telomeres. Tiny repeating sequences of 6 letters, TTAGGG, arranged in a head-to-head formation, like 2 hands pressed together in prayer. These sequences are supposed to exist at the tips of chromosomes. That is their purpose. They are caps, protective endings, molecular full stops. They are never supposed to appear in the middle, and yet there they were, pressed into the centre of chromosome 2, fused together in a pattern so precise that Ijdo could only describe it one way, the relic of an ancient fusion event. 2 chromosomes had become one. The question was not whether it had happened. The evidence was undeniable. The question was how, and perhaps more unsettling, why. Let that settle for a moment. Tonight, you don't need to hold any of this too tightly. Let the story carry you. Wherever you are, in bed, in the dark, in that quiet space between the day and sleep, let your eyes close if they want to. Let the details wash over you the way warm water fills a basin, slowly, gently, rising until the surface is still. There are no alarms here, no urgency, only an old story, a very old story, and a question that, the deeper you go, only gets stranger. The story of life on Earth, as mainstream science tells it, follows a particular kind of rhythm. It is slow, it is gradual, it moves the way a river carves a canyon, imperceptibly, over millions of years, through pressure so patient it looks almost like stillness. Single-celled organisms drifted in warm seas for billions of years before anything more complex emerged. Multicellular life took its time. Fish moved to land across tens of millions of years. Mammals remained small and quiet during the long reign of the dinosaurs. Each transition, each leap in complexity, can be traced along a timeline that looks like a gentle, upward slope. One thing becomes another, slowly. The curve is smooth, and then there is us. The human brain tripled in size in roughly 2 million years. In evolutionary terms, that is not a gentle slope. That is a cliff. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for abstract thought, language, planning, moral reasoning, expanded at a rate that has no parallel anywhere else in the mammalian fossil record. We went from chipping rocks to splitting atoms in what amounts to an evolutionary blink. We went from scratching marks on cave walls to writing symphonies, from huddling around fires to mapping the human genome itself. There is no other species that has made this kind of leap in this kind of time. Dolphins are intelligent. Crows use tools. Elephants mourn their dead. But none of them built telescopes. None of them asked why they exist. The smooth curve of evolution, the one that explains everything else, seems to hesitate when it reaches us. Not break exactly, but stutter. A moment of acceleration so sharp it leaves a kind of silence behind it. A space where the question lives. What happened? Before we go to the ancient tablets, before we open the genetic archive, consider for a moment the body you're lying in right now. Feel the weight of your spine against the bed. That spine, the column that holds you upright, was not originally designed for upright posture. The vertebrae, the discs between them, the curve of the lumbar region. These are adaptations of a structure that spent hundreds of millions of years in a horizontal orientation. Fish, reptiles, quadrupedal mammals walking on 4 legs, their spines held like bridges between hip and shoulder. The transition to bipedalism was recent, and it shows. Chronic lower back pain affects roughly 80% of humans at some point in their lives. Herniated discs, sciatica, spinal stenosis. These are not diseases. They are consequences of a body that was asked to stand before its architecture was ready. Consider your skin. Humans are the only primate to have lost almost all of their body hair. We are naked to the sun in a way that no other great ape is. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all are protected by dense coats of fur that shield them from ultraviolet radiation. We burn, we blister. We developed melanin as a defense, and it helps, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. We are a tropical primate that cannot comfortably sit in the tropical sun. Consider the act of swallowing. Your larynx, the voice box, sits lower in your throat than it does in any other primate. This descent is what gives you the ability to produce the extraordinary range of sounds that make up human speech, language, the thing that arguably defines us. But the cost of that descent is that your airway and your esophagus share a crossing point. Food and air pass through the same space. You can choke. No other primate chokes with the frequency that humans do. Speech was purchased at the price of a design flaw that kills thousands of people every year, and then there is childbirth. The human pelvis narrowed when we stood upright. The human skull expanded when our brains tripled in size. These two changes occurred in the same species, on the same body, and they are in direct mechanical conflict. The result is that human childbirth is more painful, more dangerous, and more likely to be fatal than in virtually any other mammal. A horse gives birth in minutes. A human being labours for hours, sometimes days, and throughout most of history the outcome was far from certain. None of these things are mysteries in the conventional sense. Evolutionary biology has explanations for each of them. They are trade-offs, compromises, the price paid for the advantages of walking upright, speaking and thinking abstractly. But taken together, they paint a portrait of a creature that seems caught between two designs, as if the blueprint was changed partway through, and the body was asked to accommodate a revision it was never quite built for. For most of the 20th century, the search for human origins was a search for bones, fossil fragments, jaw pieces, skull caps dug from East African sediment layers and carefully dated by the strata they were found in. The names are familiar: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and the gaps between them are the famous missing links that generations of paleoanthropologists have tried to fill. Some of those gaps have been narrowed. New fossils surface every decade. But the deeper problem was never the bones. Bones can tell you about shape, about posture, about diet. What they cannot tell you, with precision, is what happened at the molecular level, the instructions themselves, the code. In 1990, an effort was launched that would change everything. The Human Genome Project, a collaboration between the United States Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, and research institutions across the world, set out to do something that many scientists at the time considered impossibly ambitious. They would read the entire human genome, all 3 billion base pairs, every letter of the genetic code that makes you who you are. It took 13 years. When it was declared essentially complete on April 14, 2003, 2 years ahead of schedule and under its $2.7 billion budget, it covered roughly 99% of the gene-containing regions of the genome, with an accuracy of 99.99%. Francis Collins, who had taken over as project head from James Watson himself, called it the beginning of a new era. And it was. But within that new era, there were findings that did not fit as neatly as expected. Here is what was expected: a clean bridge, a genetic continuity between humans and our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, that would mirror the smooth curve of the fossil record. And in many ways, that is exactly what was found. Roughly 98.7% of the human genome is shared with chimpanzees. The kinship is undeniable. But within that remaining fraction, that narrow margin of difference, there are details that demand a closer look. Every great ape on Earth, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, has 48 chromosomes, 24 pairs. This is consistent across all of them, a genetic signature shared by our closest living relatives. Humans have 46, 23 pairs. Somewhere in the lineage that leads to us, an entire pair of chromosomes was lost. Or more precisely, 2 chromosomes were fused into one. The result is human chromosome 2, the chromosome that Jacob Ida was examining in his Yale laboratory in 1991, when he found those telomeres buried in the centre. The evidence for this fusion is specific and detailed. Let me walk you through it quietly, because the precision matters. Every chromosome has a centromere, a central constriction point, the place where the spindle fibres attach during cell division. A chromosome should have 1 centromere. Chromosome 2 has the remnants of 2. One is active, the other is vestigial, deactivated, sitting in the region around Q21.3 to Q22.1, a ghost centromere, left over from the chromosome that was absorbed in the fusion. Every chromosome has telomeres at its tips, those repeating TTAGGG sequences that Ida was studying. They exist only at the ends, But in chromosome 2 at band Q13, there is an additional set of telomere sequences sitting deep in the interior of the chromosome. Not at the ends, in the middle, arranged head-to-head, fused together as if two chromosome tips had been pressed against each other and sealed shut. The mainstream scientific explanation is straightforward. Sometime during human evolution, two ancestral chromosomes, homologous to chimpanzee chromosomes 2A and 2B, fused end-to-end. The telomeres of one chromosome met the telomeres of another, and they joined. One centromere remained active, the other was silenced. The result was a single, larger chromosome. This is a known phenomenon. Chromosomal fusions have been documented in other species. A 2023 analysis by Poshovietka and colleagues estimated that this fusion event occurred approximately 900,000 years ago, with a confidence interval stretching from 400,000 to 1.5 million years, placing it squarely in the period when the human lineage was diverging most dramatically from its primate ancestors. The science is solid, the evidence is real, but notice what it leaves open. The fusion event explains the mechanics, how 48 became 46. It does not explain why this reduction coincided with the most explosive period of cognitive development in the history of life on Earth. Fewer chromosomes, more intelligence. That is not a pattern that appears anywhere else in biology. If anything, the expectation would be the opposite, a loss of genetic material, a narrowing of possibilities. And yet the opposite occurred. This is the space where the ancient world enters the conversation, not as proof, but as a question that the ancient world asked long before genetics existed. Breathe. Let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you're resting. The sheets against your skin. The weight of the blanket. The quiet hum of the room around you. We're going somewhere very old now. Somewhere that smells of river clay and dust and the dry heat of a land that once sat between two rivers. In the British Museum in London, in room 56, there is a clay tablet roughly the size of a human hand. It is broken. Its surface is covered in the small wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script. The oldest known writing system in the world. This tablet is designated BM78941, and it is part of a set of 3 tablets that together contain the Epic of Atrahasis, one of the oldest narrative texts ever discovered. The tablets were written by a scribe named Epic in the city of Sippar in what is now southern Iraq, around 1635 BCE. Sippar sat on the banks of the Euphrates, a city of temples and scribes, and Epic worked in the tradition of Akkadian literature, a tradition that drew heavily on even older Sumerian sources stretching back at least another 1,000 years. The third tablet of Epic copy is in 2 pieces. The larger fragment, called C1, remains in London. The smaller fragment, C2, sits in the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva. For more than 50 years, scholars suspected the 2 pieces might join together, but no one had ever been able to test it. The fragments were in different countries, behind different glass cases in different institutions. Then, in the summer of 2017, researchers used 3D computational geometry to create digital replicas of both fragments from approximately 150 photographs each. They mapped the elevation of each broken edge. They matched the peaks and valleys of one to the opposing features of the other. The join was confirmed. 2 pieces of a story separated by time and geography reunited. And what the story says when you read it with modern eyes is extraordinary. The Atrahasis epic opens with a line that has haunted scholars since it was first translated. When the gods were man, they bore the labour, they carried the load. In the story, the cosmos is divided among 3 great powers. Anu rules the heavens, Enlil rules the earth, Enki, sometimes called Ea, rules the deep waters, the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the ground. Beneath these 3, there is a labour force. The Igigi, the lesser gods, the younger generation, are tasked with the physical work of maintaining the world. They dig the Tigris, they excavate the Euphrates, they open springs from the depths and build the irrigation canals that make the land fertile, and they do this for years. The text says they counted years of drudgery. 40 years, perhaps more. The number is partly lost to damage on the tablet, but the weight of the work is clear. The Igigi are exhausted, and they are angry. The rebellion, when it comes, is described with remarkable specificity. According to the scholarly translation by Wilfred G. Lambert and Alan Millard, published in 1969 and based on the newly assembled Old Babylonian text. The Igigi set fire to their tools. They surround Enlil's house by night. They besiege the gate. When Enlil wakes and discovers the revolt, a messenger is sent to the divine assembly. The Igigi's complaint is read aloud. Every one of us gods has declared war. We have set an end to the digging. Excessive drudgery has killed us. Our forced labour was heavy, the misery too much. And the assembly of the great gods listens, and they agree. The complaint is just. The labour is too much. So Enki proposes a solution. Here is the passage that has generated more alternative interpretation than perhaps any other in Mesopotamian literature. Enki speaks to the assembly and proposes a solution, and I am drawing here from the composite translation by Stephanie Daly, published by Oxford University Press in 1989. The birth goddess is summoned to create a being from clay mixed with divine blood. Some alternative researchers have read this passage as implying that a creature already existed, a being already living in the world, and that what was needed was not creation from nothing, but modification. The text itself does not state this explicitly. What it describes is the creation of a new being through the mixing of materials. But the alternative reading infers, based on the biological language of the text, that the process resembles modification more than creation ex nihilo. The birth goddess, called variously Mami, Nintu, or Belet Ili depending on the version, is summoned. A god named We-Ila, described as one who had intelligence, who had temu, the Akkadian word for understanding or reason, is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay, and from this mixture, from the blending of divine essence with earthly material, the first human beings are shaped. The text is explicit about the result. Mami speaks. You ordered me the task, and I have completed it. You have slaughtered the god, along with his inspiration. I have done away with your heavy forced labour. I have imposed your drudgery on man. And the great gods ran, free of care, and kissed her feet. In the standard academic reading, this is creation mythology. It is a story about why humans exist, to serve the gods, to tend the land, to offer sacrifices. It is a narrative of purpose, of cosmic division of labour, and that reading is valid. It is the foundation upon which decades of Assyriology has been built. But consider the specific elements as the alternative researchers do. The mixing of biological materials from two different sources, a deliberate act of engineering designed to produce a being capable of performing tasks too burdensome for the existing labour force, and the clear implication, stated outright in the text, that this new creature was made to serve, not to rule, not to think beyond its station, but to work. Is it mythology? Of course. Is it only mythology? That is the question the alternative researchers have been asking for decades. And whether or not you accept their conclusions, the question itself is worth sitting with. Let us hold two ideas at once, the way you might hold two stones in the same palm, feeling the weight of each without choosing between them. On one hand, mainstream genetics tells us that human chromosome 2 is the product of a natural fusion event. Two ancestral primate chromosomes fused tip to tip sometime between 400,000 and 1.5 million years ago. The evidence, the internal telomeres, the vestigial centromere, is well documented, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Ijdo and colleagues in 1991, and confirmed by subsequent studies of the genomic structure surrounding the fusion site, including a detailed 2002 analysis published in Genome Research. On the other hand, the Atrahasis Epic, written more than 3,600 years ago, describes the deliberate modification of an existing creature by a technologically advanced group of beings. The process involves the mixing of biological material. The result is a new kind of being, one with intelligence, with the capacity for labour, with what the text calls temu, understanding. And this being is explicitly designed to be limited, to work, to serve, not to challenge. The alternative interpretation, advanced most prominently by Zecharia Sitchin in his 1976 book The 12th Planet, and expanded by subsequent researchers, proposes that the chromosome fusion was not an accident of nature but a deliberate genetic intervention, that the Akkadian texts are not mythology but a historical record, transmitted through oral tradition and eventually written down in cuneiform by scribes who did not fully understand the technology they were describing. In this reading, clay is not literal clay, but a metaphor for biological substrate. Blood of a god is not magical essence, but DNA from a genetically advanced species. The fusion of 2 chromosomes into one was a design choice, a way to create reproductive isolation between the modified species and the original population it was derived from. This is a radical claim. It is not supported by mainstream science. It is not the conclusion that the archaeological or genetic evidence compels, but it is, undeniably, a question that the evidence permits. And the precision of the parallels, a pre-existing creature modified by mixing its material with that of a more advanced being, producing a new species designed for labour, is specific enough to warrant at least a quiet pause. Let your breath slow a little. We're going deeper now, into the quiet interior of the code itself, where things get stranger still. When the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, one of its most surprising findings was how little of the genome actually codes for proteins. The human genome contains approximately 20,000 to 25,000 protein-coding genes. That sounds like a lot, but those genes account for only about 1.5% of the total genome. The remaining 98.5% was, for years, dismissed with a term that now sounds almost embarrassingly premature: junk DNA. The assumption was straightforward. If a stretch of DNA does not code for a protein, it serves no function. It is evolutionary debris, leftover fragments from ancient viral infections, duplicated sequences that went nowhere, broken gene copies that were never cleaned up, molecular clutter. That assumption has been steadily challenged over the past 2 decades. The ENCODE project, the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, launched in 2003 and publishing its first major findings in 2012, reported that at least 80% of the genome shows some form of biochemical activity. This claim remains debated. Some biologists argue that biochemical activity does not necessarily equal biological function, and that a more conservative estimate of truly functional non-coding DNA may be lower. But even the most cautious interpretations acknowledge vast stretches of regulatory elements, enhancers, silencers, sequences that control when and where genes are turned on and off. What was dismissed as junk is increasingly revealed as something far more complex. And buried within that operating system is something that connects directly to the story we have been following tonight. Approximately 8% of the human genome, more than 4 times the amount dedicated to protein-coding genes, consists of sequences derived from ancient retroviruses. These are called human endogenous retroviruses, or HERVs. They are the molecular fossils of infections that occurred tens of millions of years ago, when a retrovirus inserted its genetic material into the DNA of a human ancestor's reproductive cells. That insertion became permanent. It was passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, until it became as much a part of the human genome as the genes for eye colour or blood type. Most of these viral remnants are inert. They have accumulated so many mutations over the millennia that they can no longer produce functional viral proteins. They are, in the language of molecular biology, defective, dead code, but not all of them. In the year 2000, a team of researchers led by Shangding Mi published a paper in the journal Nature that identified a gene called syncytin-1. It was derived from the envelope gene of an ancient retrovirus belonging to the HERVW family. And it was not dead. It was active, highly expressed, and performing a function so critical that without it, human reproduction would be impossible. Syncytin-1 is responsible for the formation of the syncytia trophoblast, the outer layer of the placenta, the barrier between mother and fetus. It works by fusing cells together, the same mechanism the original virus used to enter cells. An infection that occurred perhaps 25 to 30 million years ago left behind a gene that was co-opted, domesticated, tamed, and turned into a tool for building the organ that nourishes every human being before birth. A second gene, syncytin-2, derived from a different retroviral family called HERVFRD, was subsequently identified. It performs a complementary function, contributing to the immunosuppressive properties that prevent the mother's immune system from rejecting the fetus as foreign tissue. These are not speculative claims. They are published in peer-reviewed journals. Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PLOS Biology. The evidence is robust, and what it tells us is remarkable, that the human body is in part built with tools borrowed from ancient viruses, that our capacity to reproduce depends on genetic material that was not originally ours, that the line between self and other at the molecular level is far blurrier than we ever imagined. In the alternative reading, these endogenous retroviruses are not accidents. They are patches, updates, pieces of code inserted at specific points in the genome to steer development in particular directions. Larger brains, more efficient immune systems, the ability to carry pregnancies to term despite the mechanical mismatch between skull and pelvis. Mainstream science would say that these viral insertions were random, and that natural selection retained the ones that proved useful. The alternative view would say that the randomness is an illusion, that the distribution of these elements is too functional, too precisely placed, to be the product of chance alone. Neither view can be proven beyond doubt, but both are worth holding in the mind, like two candles burning in the same room, casting different shadows on the same wall. Let us return to Mesopotamia. The Atrahasis epic does not end with the creation of humanity. It continues, and what follows is, in many ways, the more troubling part of the story. The humans multiply. They are fruitful. They fill the land. And then, according to the text, they begin to disturb the gods. The Akkadian terms used are rigmu and hubaru, noise, clamour, disturbance. In the standard translation, Enlil is kept awake by the racket of the growing human population. He cannot sleep, and so he resolves to destroy them. First, he sends plague. The text describes Namtar, the god of pestilence, being unleashed upon the people. Sickness, headache, and disease blow into them like a storm. But Enki, the god of wisdom, the same god who designed the human creation, warns his favourite human, Atrahasis, to redirect worship away from the other gods and toward Namtar specifically, and the plague is lifted. So Enlil tries again. He sends famine. The rains are withheld. The fields turn to dust. Again, Enki finds a way to help Atrahasis survive, and then comes the flood. The Atrahasis flood narrative predates the biblical account in Genesis by more than 1,000 years. The parallels are striking: a chosen man warned by a sympathetic deity, a boat constructed to specific instructions, animals loaded aboard, a catastrophic deluge that destroys the rest of humanity, a sacrifice offered after the waters recede. The British Museum's own description of the Atrahasis tablets notes these similarities explicitly. But the motivation is different. In the biblical account, the flood is sent because of human wickedness. In the Atrahasis epic, it is sent because of noise, because humans were too much, too loud, too present, too alive. What kind of noise troubles a god? The standard scholarly interpretation, articulated by researchers including William L. Moran of Harvard and A.D. Kilmer of the University of California, Berkeley, is that, quote, 5 is a metaphor for population growth, or perhaps for cultural vitality, for the uncontrollable exuberance of a species that was multiplying beyond its intended purpose. Giovanni Pettinato and Wolfram von Soden interpreted it as a kind of social rebellion, an echo of the Igigi revolt now repeated in the human sphere. Some alternative researchers have gone further, suggesting that quote 6 might not be about sound at all, but about signal, about consciousness, about a kind of collective awareness that could have been emerging in the human population, one that was not part of the original design. This is a speculative reading with no direct textual support, but it draws on the fact that the Akkadian texts use quote 7 in a context where population growth alone seems an insufficient motive for attempted genocide. Something about humanity's development, these readers suggest, crossed a threshold that the creators found threatening. Whether you read it as myth, metaphor, or memory, the shape of the story is the same. Humanity was created to serve, and then it became something more than intended, and the response of the creators was fear. Take a slow breath. We are going to southern Africa now, to a place so old that the very stones remember. In the northwest corner of the kingdom of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, there is a mountain shaped like a crocodile. The Swazi call it Ngwenya. On its southern flank, cut into the rock, is the oldest known mine on Earth. In the 1960s, archaeologists discovered stone tools inside the lion cavern at Ngwenya that were unlike those found at typical Stone Age habitation sites. They were specialised: choppers, picks, and hammers made from dolerite, a hard volcanic rock. These were not general-purpose tools. These were mining tools. Charcoal nodules found at the site were sent for radiocarbon dating in 1964. The result? At least 41,000 to 43,000 years old. Subsequent optically stimulated luminescence dating confirmed the range. The Ngwenya mine was in operation during the Middle Stone Age, tens of thousands of years before the oldest known cities, before agriculture, before pottery, before the invention of the wheel. What were they mining? Red hematite and specularet, iron-bearing minerals that produce a vivid red pigment when ground. Ochre. The ancestors of the San people used it for body adornment, ritual, and the rock paintings that still survive across southern Africa. Isotopic analysis has traced ochre from Ngwenya to sites over 200 kilometers away, suggesting organized extraction and long-distance trade networks operating more than 40,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology is clear. This was human activity. Homo sapiens. Our direct ancestors engaged in organized, labor-intensive mining for mineral resources at a depth and scale that implies planning, cooperation, and intergenerational knowledge transfer. The alternative interpretation looks at the same evidence and asks a different question. If humans were mining minerals in southern Africa 43,000 years ago, at a scale that implies organization far beyond what we typically associate with hunter-gatherer societies of the period, what were they mining for? Red ochre is valuable, but is it valuable enough to explain the scale of operation? Or is it possible that what appears to be ochre mining is actually a later phase of something older and more extensive, an operation whose original purpose has been obscured by the passage of millennia? The Atrahasis epic says that humans were created to relieve the gods of their labour. The Sumerian texts describe the Abzu, the domain of Enki, as a place of subterranean water and mineral wealth. Some alternative researchers, most notably Zechariah Sitchin, have mapped the concept of the Abzu onto the mineral-rich regions of southeastern Africa, suggesting a connection between the world's oldest mines and the regions described in Sumerian cosmology. This mapping is not supported by mainstream Assyriology. The Abzu is generally understood as a mythological concept referring to the subterranean freshwater that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the Earth's surface. But the coincidence of ancient mining activity in the same broad region has kept the alternative reading alive. Is this a coincidence? Perhaps. Is it the kind of coincidence that makes you pause, lying in the dark, feeling the weight of 43,000 years pressing gently on the edge of thought? It might be. The Atrahasis account of human creation includes a detail that often gets overlooked, but that resonates with unusual clarity against what we now know about human reproductive biology. After the mixing of clay and blood, after the fashioning of the first beings, the text describes a process that involves not one birth but 14, 7 males and 7 females, and they are gestated not in the womb of a human female, because human females do not yet exist in sufficient number, but in the wombs of divine beings, the birth goddesses, volunteers. The text, as translated by Lambert and Millard, describes the process with language that suggests difficulty, strain, complication. The birth is not easy. This echoes a biological reality that we discussed earlier, the mismatch between the human pelvis and the human skull. Obstetric difficulty. The fact that human childbirth is uniquely dangerous among primates. If you were reading the text as a record of an actual genetic engineering program, the complications described in the Atrahasis would be exactly what you would expect from a first-generation hybrid, a being whose head is too large for the birth canal of the surrogate carrying it. After these initial births, the text transitions to a phase where human beings are given the ability to reproduce on their own. Self-sustaining reproduction. The need for divine surrogates is eliminated, but the difficulty of birth remains. A design inheritance, passed down through every generation, from that moment to this one. Tonight, lying here, you carry that inheritance in your body. Every person who has ever been born came through that narrow passage, that impossible squeeze, that mechanical contradiction that should not work but somehow does. And the oldest written story about the origin of that difficulty says it was not accidental. It was the after effect of a process that was never meant to be painless. There is another Mesopotamian text, stranger, less well known, that tells the story of Adapa. Fragments of this myth have been found both at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, dating to around the 14th century BCE, and in the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE. Adapa is a sage, a priest of the temple of Enki in the city of Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia. He is described as supremely wise, created by Enki as a kind of model human, a prototype. In the myth, Adapa is summoned to the heavens, to the court of Anu, the supreme god. He is offered the bread and water of eternal life, and he refuses them. Enki has warned him that what he is being offered is the bread and water of death, and Adapa trusts his creator's counsel. But the text reveals that Enki's warning was wrong. The bread and water were genuine gifts of immortality. Whether Enki deliberately deceived Adapa or was genuinely mistaken, the result is the same. Adapa walks away mortal. Scholars have debated the motivation for centuries. One reading suggests Enki tricked Adapa to ensure that humans would never achieve immortality. That mortality was the price of continued existence, a condition imposed to keep the created species from becoming too powerful. Another reading suggests Enki was genuinely trying to protect Adapa from what he believed was a trap. The text is ambiguous enough to support both interpretations, but the result, as the myth tells it, is clear. Human beings are mortal. Death is built in. The limit is set. And it is set not by the inherent fragility of biological life, but by the actions of the very being who created humanity in the first place. In molecular biology, there is a structure at the tips of every chromosome that functions as a kind of biological clock. These are the telomeres, the same repeating TTA and GGG sequences that Ijdo found fused in the center of chromosome 2. But at the tips where they are supposed to be, telomeres serve a different function. They protect the chromosome during cell division, and with each division they shorten slightly. When they become too short, the cell can no longer divide. It ages. It dies. Telomere length is, in a very real sense, the mechanism that enforces mortality. The enzyme that can replenish telomeres, Telomeres, is present in the genome of every human cell. The gene for it exists, but in most adult cells it is silenced, turned off. The instructions for cellular immortality are written in your DNA, and they have been deliberately suppressed. Is this the bread and water of Adapa, a capacity for indefinite renewal, present in the code, offered, and then withdrawn? The gene exists. The enzyme works. It is active in cancer cells, in reproductive cells, in certain stem cells. But in the rest of the body it is quiet. And so we age, and so we die. The myth says this was a choice, not ours. Let us go deeper still, into a layer of the genome that most people never hear about, where the strangeness intensifies. We spoke earlier about endogenous retroviruses, the 8% of the human genome composed of ancient viral insertions. We discussed syncytin-1 and its role in placental formation. But the story of these viral elements extends much further. Research published over the past decade has revealed that endogenous retroviruses are not randomly scattered through the genome. They cluster in specific locations. They are disproportionately active in specific tissues, particularly the placenta and the brain. And some of them have been co-opted not just for structural functions, but for regulatory ones. They serve as enhancers, switches that control when and where other genes are activated. A striking example emerged from a study by Dunn-Fletcher and colleagues, who discovered that an endogenous retroviral element had been co-opted as a placenta-specific enhancer for the gene encoding corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, a hormone intimately involved in the timing of human birth. The retroviral element does not code for a protein. It controls a clock. It helps determine when labour begins. An ancient virus, embedded in the genome millions of years ago, now helps decide when a human being is born. This is not speculation. It is published molecular biology. The deeper you look, the more examples you find. Endogenous retroviruses influencing immune response. Endogenous retroviruses affecting brain development. Endogenous retroviruses shaping the very architecture of the regulatory networks that make us human. The mainstream interpretation, random infection, followed by natural selection that retained the useful insertions and discarded the rest. The alternative interpretation, targeted modification, using viral vectors as delivery mechanisms, precisely the technology that modern gene therapy employs today. In a gene therapy procedure, a virus is engineered to carry a specific piece of genetic code into a target cell. The virus does what viruses do. It inserts its payload into the host genome, but the payload is not viral. It is a correction, an enhancement, a deliberate edit. The parallels are precise enough to note, not to prove, but to note. We have been gentle tonight, quiet. The story has moved like a river in the dark, wide, slow, carrying you forward without effort. But there is one more passage from the ancient world that deserves mention before we turn toward the larger questions, and it is, in its own way, the most haunting. In the ruins of Ur, in the cities of Sumer, archaeologists have found a series of texts known as the Lamentations. These are poems of grief, written in the aftermath of the destruction of the Sumerian city-states around 2000 BCE. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur. The imagery in these texts is vivid, specific, and strange. People fall dead in the streets without visible wounds. The air itself becomes poison. Water turns bitter. Food becomes contaminated. Animals sicken and die. The descriptions do not readily match conventional warfare or famine in their specifics, though scholars note that poetic exaggeration is common in lamentation literature, and the imagery may be literary convention rather than literal reportage. Some alternative researchers have suggested that the imagery bears a resemblance to the effects of acute radiation exposure, sudden death without external wounds, contaminated water and food, lingering illness. This is a speculative reading, not a mainstream scholarly position. Most Assyriologists interpret these texts as conventional poetic expressions of grief following military defeat and environmental disaster. But the specificity of certain passages, the evil wind that kills silently, the bitter water, the bodies without wounds, is striking enough that the alternative interpretation continues to attract attention. Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist who excavated Ur between 1922 and 1934 on behalf of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, uncovered layers of the city that showed abrupt, catastrophic destruction. His most famous discovery, the Royal Cemetery, with its gold headdresses and sacrificed attendants, its bull-headed lyre of gold and lapis lazuli, dates from roughly 2600 BCE. But beneath the layers of wealth and ritual, beneath the evidence of ordinary human life, there were strata of sudden devastation. What destroyed Sumer? The historical answer involves invasions by the Elamites and the Amorites, combined with environmental degradation and shifts in the course of the Euphrates. The alternative researchers point to the Lamentations texts and suggest something more extreme, a catastrophe involving weapons or forces that the writers could only describe in the language of divine wrath. There is no proof. There are only texts, and the question they leave behind hanging in the warm air of a Mesopotamian night 3,000 years gone. Step back now. Let the details settle, like sediment drifting through dark water, slowly finding the bottom. What do we have? We have a chromosome fusion event that mainstream science dates to a period of explosive cognitive development. We have ancient texts from the oldest writing civilization on Earth that describe the deliberate creation of a worker species through the mixing of biological materials. We have endogenous retroviral elements, ancient viral code embedded in the genome, that perform critical functions in human reproduction and development. We have the oldest mine on Earth, 43,000 years old, in the same broad region that some alternative researchers identify with the Sumerian concept of the Abzu. We have texts describing a population of created beings that grew too numerous, too vocal, too something, and the response was attempted destruction. Individually, each of these is a curiosity, a detail with a conventional explanation and an unconventional one, a door that might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere. Together they form a shape, not a proof, a shape, a suggestion in the data, like a figure glimpsed through fog. You cannot say for certain what it is, but you can say that something is there, and the shape says this. What if the human story is not entirely our own? What if the code we carry was not entirely written by the blind hand of natural selection? What if there is a signature inside us? In the fused chromosomes, in the viral insertions, in the strange mismatch between our bodies and our minds, that points to an authorship we have not yet fully understood. Stay with me a little longer. We're drifting now, the current slow, the water warm. There is one more thread woven through this story that deserves attention, because it runs from the very first Sumerian tablets all the way to the vault beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where roughly 6,000 tons of gold bars sit stacked in a room carved from the bedrock of Manhattan. Gold is strange, not in the way that most people think about it. We have been trained to accept gold's value as a given, a kind of natural law, the way we accept that water is wet or the sky is blue. But pause for a moment and ask the question plainly. Why gold. It is not the strongest metal. It is not the hardest. It is too soft to make tools or weapons. You cannot eat it. You cannot burn it for warmth. In a survival scenario, on a desert island, in the aftermath of a catastrophe, gold is the most useless substance you could possess. A lump of gold will not keep you alive for a single additional hour, and yet, from the earliest moments of recorded civilization, human beings have treated gold as though it was sacred. The royal tombs of excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1926 and 1934, contained gold in staggering quantities. Queen Puabi's headdress, reconstructed from the careful excavation of her tomb around 2600 BCE, was made of gold leaves, gold ribbons, and gold beads arranged in wreaths, golden cups, golden daggers with lapis lazuli handles, golden lyres with bull heads covered in gold foil. Woolley found so much gold that he sent coded telegrams to the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, afraid that if the news leaked, the site would be looted. This was not an isolated obsession. The Egyptians called gold the flesh of the gods. They lined their pharaohs' coffins with it. They covered their temple walls with it. They ground it into paint and applied it to the eyes of their statues. Across the ocean in the Americas, the Inca called gold, quote one, and built entire gardens of golden plants and golden birds. In ancient China, alchemists spent centuries trying to transmute base metals into gold, believing it held the secret to immortality. In India, gold has been associated with purity and divinity for at least 5,000 years. Every civilization, every continent, every age. The obsession is universal, and it is irrational, and it began before anyone understood gold's actual useful properties, its conductivity, its resistance to corrosion, its applications in electronics and aerospace. The Sumerian texts address gold directly. In the alternative reading of the Atrahasis and related texts, gold is the entire reason for the enterprise. The Anunnaki came to Earth because they needed gold. The Igigi were set to mining it. When the Igigi revolted, humans were created to replace them. The entire arc of the story, creation, labour, rebellion, flood, revolves around the extraction of a single element. Modern neuroscience has shown that the perception of wealth-associated stimuli activates reward centres in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, in ways that can be disproportionate to actual utility. While no specific study has isolated gold exclusively, research on material desire and reward circuitry suggests that our attraction to precious metals and wealth symbols operates at a level that goes deeper than rational assessment. We respond to gold with a visceral pull that seems out of proportion to its practical value. The alternative reading asks whether this could be more than cultural conditioning, whether it might reflect something embedded at a deeper level, a compulsion woven into the reward system itself, ensuring that even after the original purpose had been forgotten, the behaviour would persist. Based on what we know about how deeply reward circuits are wired, it is at least conceivable that such a preference could have biological roots alongside cultural ones. Is that paranoid? Is it mythology? Or is it the kind of hypothesis that, once you hear it, you cannot quite stop noticing evidence for? There is a moment in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis chapter 11, that echoes through every culture that has heard it. The people of the earth, united by a single language, decide to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. God sees what they are building, and he is troubled. Not because the tower will succeed, but because of what the unity it represents might make possible. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Nothing will be restrained from them. The concern is not the tower, it is the capacity, the potential. A united humanity with a single language represents a collective intelligence so powerful that in the words of the text, nothing they imagine will be beyond their reach. So the language is confounded, shattered, broken into fragments, the people are scattered, the tower is abandoned. The Sumerian version of this story, found in a text called Enmerka and the Lord of Aratta, dating to roughly 2100 BCE, which predates the biblical account by more than a millennium, describes a time when the whole universe, the people in unison, spoke to Enlil in one tongue. The Sumerian phrase suggests not merely a shared vocabulary but a shared mode of understanding, a capacity for collective thought that transcended the need for words. The neuroscience of language centres in the brain. Broca's area, responsible for speech production, and Wernicke's area, responsible for language comprehension, shows that these regions are among the most recently evolved structures in the human brain. They are the hardware for linguistic diversity, for the ability to produce and understand thousands of different languages, each with its own syntax, grammar, and vocabulary. But what if linguistic diversity is not an achievement? What if it is a partition, a deliberate fragmentation of something that was once unified? The alternative reading of the Tower of Babel story and its Sumerian predecessors proposes exactly this: that the original human capacity was not for spoken language at all, but for something more direct, a resonance, a shared field, what some researchers call collective consciousness, and what the texts describe as one tongue, and that the division of languages was not a divine punishment for arrogance, but a deliberate neurological restructuring, a rewiring of the brain to ensure that the noise of mankind could never again reach the threshold that had alarmed the gods. This is, of course, highly speculative, but the structure of the story is consistent across cultures. Humanity once had a capacity that made it dangerous. That capacity was deliberately broken, and the breaking scattered us into tribes, into nations, into competing groups that could never again unite long enough to rediscover what they had lost. Until, perhaps now. Because what is the internet if not an attempt to rebuild Babel? A technology that connects every human mind on the planet, that allows the sharing of information at the speed of light, that slowly, incrementally, is weaving the fragments of human knowledge back into something that begins to resemble a single tongue. And if the story is true, if the division was deliberate, if the breaking was designed, then the reconstruction might be the thing that, somewhere in the deep architecture of the code, was always waiting to happen. There is a detail in the neuroscience that gives this reading an unexpected resonance. Studies of bilingual and multilingual individuals have shown that speaking multiple languages literally restructures the brain. The grey matter density in the left inferior parietal cortex increases, the anterior cingulate cortex becomes more active, the executive control functions, the parts of the brain responsible for switching between systems, managing conflicting inputs, holding multiple frameworks simultaneously, are measurably enhanced. In other words, the very act of overcoming the division of languages makes the brain more powerful, as if the restriction itself, once transcended, becomes an accelerant, as if the lock, once picked, grants access to rooms that would not have existed without the lock in the first place. This is not what you would design if your goal was permanent limitation. This is what you would design if your goal was stage development, a system that restricts, then rewards the overcoming of the restriction, producing a mind more capable than either the restricted or the unrestricted version would have been alone. Is that what the genome is? A system of staged locks, each one designed to be eventually overcome, each overcoming producing a new capacity that was not possible before, the chromosome fusion, the telomere suppression, the viral insertions, the vast non-coding regions, a series of doors, each one slightly harder to open than the last, leading somewhere that only the persistent, only the curious, only the restless, only the noisy will ever reach. The Sumerians would have recognized this pattern. They called it the descent to the underworld. The hero goes down, passes through 7 gates, removes 1 garment at each gate, arrives naked and transformed. The restriction is the mechanism of the transformation. The limit is the teacher. The wall is the invitation. And here you are, tired, lying in the dark. Having spent the last hour or more walking through gates you did not know existed, you are still you. But the furniture in your mind has been rearranged, however slightly. There are doors open now that were not open before, and behind them, the darkness is not empty. It is full. There is a character in these ancient narratives who deserves more attention than he usually receives. Not Enlil, the ruler, the one who sends the plagues and the floods. Not Anu, the distant king of heaven, but Enki, the god of the waters and of wisdom, the one who, in every version of the story, stands between humanity and destruction. In the Atrahasis epic, it is Enki who designs the creation of humans. It is Enki who warns Atrahasis about the coming flood. It is Enki who provides the plans for the Ark, who ensures that the genetic blueprint, if we allow ourselves to read it that way, survives the catastrophe. In the Sumerian version of the flood story, the hero's name is Yasudra, and it is still Enki who saves him. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is called Utnapishtim, and once again, it is Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, who whispers the warning through the wall of a reed hut, finding a loophole in the divine decree. Enki is a paradox. He creates humanity on behalf of the divine council, then spends the rest of the mythological cycle protecting his creation from the very council he serves. He is both architect and saboteur, builder and rebel, the one who gives humanity the tools to survive the consequences of its own existence. In the alternative reading, Enki is not a god, he is a scientist, a geneticist who designed a species for a specific purpose but who then became, in some sense, attached to his creation, who saw potential where others saw only threat, who preserved the quote zero, the genetic information, through every attempt at deletion, ensuring that the line survived. This is a deeply human story, regardless of how you read it. The creator who loves his creation, the father who defies his own kind to protect his children, the architect who builds a back door into the system, knowing that someday someone will find it. Whether Enki was a god or a geneticist or a metaphor for the part of the universe that wants complexity to survive, his role in the narrative is clear. He is the reason we are here. If the flood was meant to erase us, Enki is why it failed. And if there is a back door somewhere in the human genome, a capacity that was suppressed but not destroyed, a potential that was locked away but not deleted, then Enki is the one who left the key. Consider how modern gene therapy works. A virus is engineered to carry a specific genetic payload into a target cell. The virus inserts its code into the host genome. The insertion is precise, targeted, designed to activate or correct a specific function. This is not science fiction. This is standard medical technology, practiced in hospitals around the world. Gene therapies using viral vectors have been approved and used clinically since the mid-2000s, with the field accelerating rapidly. Now consider the endogenous retroviruses we discussed earlier, the 8% of the human genome composed of ancient viral insertions, some of which have been co-opted for critical functions like placental formation and immune regulation. If you were looking for evidence of a gene therapy program conducted on an ancestral population, a program using viral vectors to insert functional genetic material into the germline, what would you expect to find? You would expect to find ancient viral sequences embedded in the genome, performing functions that seem too precise, too targeted, too essential to be the product of random infection alone. You would expect to find them clustered in tissues associated with the unique features of the species, the brain, the placenta, the immune system. You would expect to find that some of them are shared across primate lineages while others are unique to humans, suggesting different waves of insertion at different points in evolutionary time. You would expect to find, in other words, exactly what we find. This is not proof. Let me be clear about that. The mainstream explanation, random viral infection followed by natural selection, is entirely sufficient to account for the data. There is no gap in the scientific explanation that requires an external intelligence to fill. But the alternative reading notes the specificity, notes the function, notes the precision, and asks whether the mainstream explanation, while sufficient, is the only one the data supports. That question, too, is worth sitting with. Not to answer, just to hold. One of the most striking features of the Mesopotamian creation narrative is that it is not alone. Across cultures separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by millennia of independent development, the same core elements appear. A group of advanced beings arrives. They require labour. They modify or create a species of workers. The workers develop beyond their intended purpose. The creators attempt to destroy or limit them. A protector figure ensures survival. The species continues, carrying within it a mark, a memory, a capacity that connects it to its origins. The Popol Vuh, the creation epic of the Quiche Maya, describes multiple attempts to create humanity. The first attempt, using mud, fails. The beings dissolve. The second, using wood, produces creatures that can walk and talk but have no understanding, no reverence, no heart. They are destroyed in a flood. The third attempt, using maize, corn, the sacred grain, produces true humans, beings with intelligence, with sight, with understanding. And then the gods grow afraid. These beings can see too far, know too much. So the gods cloud their vision. They limit the scope of human perception, reducing it from the vast to the immediate. The same structure. Advanced creators, multiple attempts, a final version that works too well, a deliberate limitation imposed after the fact. In the traditions of the Dogon people of West Africa, who live in the Bandiagara escarpment of Mali, there are accounts of beings called the Nommo who came from the star system Sirius. The Nommo are described as amphibious, intelligent, and instrumental in the organization of human civilization. The specificity of the Dogon's astronomical knowledge, including their awareness of a companion star to Sirius that was not confirmed by Western astronomy until the 20th century, has been a matter of scholarly debate since the French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlen published their research in 1950. In Hindu scripture, the Puranas describe the Deva and Asuras, divine and semi-divine beings, engaged in a cosmic struggle over the churning of the ocean of milk. The purpose? To extract Amrita, the nectar of immortality. The narrative involves cooperation between competing factions, the use of a cosmic technology, Mount Mandara as a churning rod, the serpent Vasuki as a rope, and the careful management of who receives the gift of eternal life and who does not. In the mythology of the Maori of New Zealand, Tane, the god of forests and birds, shapes the first woman, Hineahon, from the red earth of Kurawaka and breathes life into her. She is not born, she is made, and the material is clay, the same material described in the Atrahasis. These parallels do not prove a single origin. They may reflect universal patterns in human myth-making, the tendency of the mind to explain its own existence through stories of creation and limitation. But the specificity of the shared elements, the clay, the blood, the modification, the fear, the limitation, is worth holding gently in the mind, not as proof, as a pattern, a whisper that persists across the centuries and the continents, saying something too quiet to make out clearly but too consistent to ignore. Let your body grow heavy now. Let the thoughts drift, the way clouds move across a night sky, slowly, weightlessly, dissolving at the edges. There is one more idea worth settling into before the night takes you. When the Human Genome Project and subsequent research mapped the so-called junk DNA, the 98.5% of the genome that does not directly code for proteins, what they found was not emptiness. It was not noise. It was structure. Vast, complex, layered structure. Portions of this non-coding DNA show patterns that some information theorists have compared to language. In the mid-1990s, researchers, including a team from Boston University, published findings suggesting that non-coding DNA sequences follow statistical patterns consistent with natural language, specifically patterns described by a principle called Zipf's law, which governs the frequency distribution of words in any human language. These findings remain debated. Some researchers have argued that Zipf-like distributions can arise from purely random processes and do not necessarily indicate meaningful information. But the observation persists, and it raises an intriguing possibility. This does not mean the genome literally contains words. It suggests that the structure of at least some non-coding regions may be more consistent with a complex information-bearing system than with random noise. Whether this reflects genuine compressed information or an artifact of how repetitive sequences accumulate remains an open question. Think of it as a library written in a script no one has yet deciphered. The books are there, the pages are full, the ink is legible, but the language is unknown. And until the right key is found, of the right enzyme, the right environmental trigger, the right moment in developmental time, the pages remain closed. Some of these pages have already been opened. The ENCODE project found that at least 80% of the genome has some biochemical function. Regulatory elements that were invisible to earlier technology are now being identified at an accelerating rate. Enhancers, silencers, insulators, long non-coding RNAs that modulate gene expression in ways that are only beginning to be understood. What else is in there? What remains to be found? The alternative interpretation says everything. That the so-called junk DNA is not debris, but dormant payload. That it contains capacities that were deliberately silenced, not deleted, but commented out, the way a programmer might disable a function in software without removing the code. Still there, still intact, waiting. Mainstream science would caution against this interpretation. There is no evidence for deliberate silencing by an external intelligence. The regulatory structure of the genome can be explained by evolutionary mechanisms: duplication, mutation, selection, co-option. But the metaphor is powerful, and tonight, lying in the dark, feeling your breath move in and out without effort, feeling your heart beat without instruction, feeling the immense and silent machinery of your body working according to a code that was written long before you were born. It is worth wondering, even if only for a moment, what else that code might say if the right page were turned. There is a detail from the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents in existence, dating in its earliest form to around 2100 BCE, that has puzzled scholars for as long as it has been known. The king list records the reigns of monarchs in Sumerian city-states, beginning with a phrase that has no parallel in any other ancient chronological record: _(1_). The list then catalogues a series of kings whose reign lengths are, by any modern standard, impossible. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar, also of Eridu, for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibera for 43,200 years. The pre-flood kings, taken together, are said to have reigned for a total of 241,200 years. After the flood, (2), the reign lengths drop dramatically. The first post-flood king, Jukur of Kish, reigned for 1,200 years. Later, kings reigned for hundreds of years, then decades, converging gradually with historically verifiable timelines. The standard scholarly interpretation is that these numbers are symbolic. They may reflect a mathematical system based on the Sumerian sexagesimal numbering system, base 60, which gave us the 60-second minute and the 360-degree circle. The pre-flood numbers may encode calendrical cycles, astronomical periods, or ritual significance rather than literal lifespans. The alternative interpretation reads the declining reign lengths as a record of declining lifespan. If the early kings were not fully human, if they carried more of the original, "3 genetic material, then their lifespans might have been genuinely longer. The gradual decrease would reflect dilution, as the original genetic endowment was dispersed through interbreeding with unmodified humans over successive generations. This mirrors, intriguingly, the pattern described in the Hebrew Bible, where the patriarchs' lifespans decline from Methuselah's 969 years to Abraham's 175 to Moses's 120, converging on the modern human range. Whether these numbers are symbolic or historical, they encode the same idea. Something was lost. A capacity that the earliest humans possessed was gradually diminished, generation by generation, until only its echo remained. Consider what it means to be a species that remembers, not just individually, though human memory is remarkable, capable of holding a lifetime of sensory experience in the folds of a 3-pound organ, but collectively. We are the only species that writes things down, that carves stories into clay and preserves them for millennia, that builds museums to house the fragments of its own past, that sends probes into interstellar space carrying golden records of human music and human speech, on the chance that someone, something, somewhere might find them and wonder who we were. The Atrahasis tablets have survived for more than 3,600 years. They have been broken, scattered, carried across continents, buried in sand, and dug up by archaeologists who spoke languages that did not exist when the tablets were written. And they are still readable. The story still speaks. Why? Why do we preserve? Why do we feel the compulsion to record, to archive, to ensure that what we know does not die when we do? Most animals live entirely in the present. They react to stimuli, they learn from experience, they pass on genes. But they do not write histories. They do not tell creation myths. They do not argue about whether the tablets are mythology or memory. The compulsion to remember, to transmit, to preserve, to understand our own origins, is itself one of the most distinctive features of the human species. And if the Atrahasis is correct, even metaphorically, it may be the feature that matters most. Because the tablets are not just a record of what happened, they are a record of what we are. And the act of reading them, of trying to understand them, of lying in the dark and wondering what they mean, is itself a continuation of the story they tell. A species that was designed to dig is, instead, reading. A species that was made to serve is instead asking. A species that was meant to be limited is instead reaching. That is the noise of mankind, not the volume of our voices, the depth of our questions. But set the evidence down now, set the tablets aside, let the genome close its pages, let the ancient cities sleep in their dust. There is something else about telomeres that we have not yet discussed, something that connects the molecular biology of aging to one of the strangest stories in the entire Mesopotamian literary corpus. We mentioned earlier that telomeres shorten with each cell division, and that when they become too short, the cell can no longer divide. This is the Hayflick limit, named for Leonard Hayflick, who demonstrated in 1961 that human cells cultured in a laboratory can only divide approximately 50 to 70 times before entering senescence. After that, they stop, they age, they die. The enzyme that can reverse this process, telomerase, is present in the human genome. Every cell in your body carries the gene for it. In certain cells, it is active, in embryonic stem cells, in reproductive cells, in cells of the immune system. In cancer cells, telomerase is reactivated, which is part of what makes them immortal, dividing without limit. But in the vast majority of your cells, the gene for telomerase is silenced, switched off. The instructions for indefinite cellular renewal are written into your DNA, and they have been locked away. The Adapa myth, preserved on fragments found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt and in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, tells the story of a human who was offered immortality and was tricked into refusing it. Adapa is the wisest of humans, created by Enki to be a model for the species. He's summoned to the court of Anu after a transgression. Depending on the version, he has broken the wing of the south wind while fishing, or he has interfered with a natural force that was not meant to be touched. Before Anu, he is offered bread and water, but Enki has warned him in advance. Do not eat, do not drink, for these are the bread and water of death. Adapa, trusting his creator, refuses, and the text reveals, the bread and water were not death. They were life. Anu was offering immortality, and Enki's warning was a lie, a deliberate deception to ensure that Adapa, and through him, all of humanity, would remain mortal. The question that scholars have debated for decades is, why would Enki do this? He is humanity's protector. He saves us from the flood. He designs our creation. Why would he then conspire to keep us mortal? One answer is that mortality was the condition of humanity's continued existence. The gods, the Anunnaki, the divine council, might tolerate a useful worker species. They would not tolerate an immortal one. If humans could live forever, they would accumulate knowledge, power, awareness. They would become, in time, indistinguishable from the gods themselves. And that was the one boundary that could never be crossed. So Enki made a choice. He could give humanity everything: intelligence, language, creativity, awareness. But immortality had to remain off the table. The telomere clock had to tick. The gene had to be silenced. Not because Enki wanted his creation to suffer, but because suffering was the price of existing at all. If you read this as mythology, it is a meditation on the nature of mortality and the paradox of divine love. If you read it as genetic engineering, it is a design specification, telomerase suppression as a policy decision. The code is there, the capability exists, but the switch is turned off by design, and you carry that design in every cell of your body right now. The enzyme that could theoretically allow your cells to renew indefinitely is written in your genome. It is not missing, it is not broken, it is silenced. The bread and water of Adapa, sitting untouched on a table in heaven, while the wisest human ever created walks away, mortal, into the long descent of years. Let us return, one final time, to the flood. The Atrahasis epic describes the deluge as the culmination of a series of escalating attempts to reduce the human population. Plague, famine, drought. Each time, Enki finds a way to help his chosen human survive. Each time, Enlil grows more frustrated. The flood is the final solution. A total reset. A catastrophe so complete that nothing is meant to survive. The waters rise, the cities drown. The gods themselves watch from above, horrified by what they have unleashed. The text describes them huddling in heaven, hungry, thirsty, weeping, because with the destruction of humanity, there is no one left to offer sacrifices, to tend the fields, to feed the gods. When Atrahasis survives, when his boat lands and he offers a sacrifice on the mountaintop, the gods swarm to the offering. They gather around it, hungry and grateful. And in that moment, the dynamic shifts. The gods need humans, not just as labourers, but as sustenance. The sacrifices, the rituals, the offerings, these are not symbolic. They are essential. Without humans, the gods starve. This is a detail that most alternative researchers overlook, but it is critically important. The Atrahasis does not describe a one-directional power relationship. It describes a symbiosis. The gods created humans to serve them, and in doing so, they made themselves dependent on their creation. The very act of engineering a worker species introduced a vulnerability. After the flood, the text describes a new arrangement, a compromise. Humans are allowed to persist, but with limitations. Childbirth is introduced as a mechanism of population control. Infant mortality, stillbirth, certain women designated as barren. The unlimited fertility of the pre-flood era is replaced by a regulated system. If you read this as mythology, it is an etiology, a story explaining why bad things happen, why babies die, why some women cannot conceive, why life is hard. If you read it as the record of a genetic engineering program, it describes a version update, a patch applied after a catastrophic failure. The original design, unlimited reproduction, unlimited expansion, proved unstable. The new design incorporates limits, controls, mortality rates calibrated to keep the population within manageable bounds. And if you look at the human genome with this framework in mind, you find that reproductive biology in humans is, in fact, remarkably constrained compared to other mammals. Human fertility rates are lower, the window of fertility is narrower, the complications of pregnancy and childbirth are more severe. The investment required to bring a single human child to maturity is greater than for almost any other species on Earth. These constraints are typically explained as the trade-offs of large-brained, slow-developing offspring, and that explanation is entirely adequate from a biological standpoint. But the Atrahasis says something more specific. These constraints were imposed, deliberately, after the flood, as a condition of survival. Whether you find that reading persuasive or not, the precision of the parallel is worth noticing. The text describes a specific set of reproductive limitations introduced at a specific point in the narrative. Modern human biology exhibits exactly those limitations. The connection may be coincidental, but coincidences, when they accumulate, begin to acquire a kind of gravity. You're lying in the dark. Your body is still, your breath is slow, your mind is somewhere between waking and sleep, in that liminal space where thoughts arrive without effort and dissolve without resistance. Inside you, right now, in every cell, there is a chromosome that carries the scar of a fusion event that happened roughly 900,000 years ago. Two became one, and from that one, everything followed. Language, mathematics, music, philosophy, the ability to lie in the dark and contemplate the nature of existence. Inside you, right now, there are fragments of ancient viruses, infections that occurred tens of millions of years ago, that have been co-opted to build the placenta, to regulate hormones, to shape the timing of birth itself. What was once an invasion is now essential architecture. Inside you, right now, there is an enzyme, Telomeres, that could, if activated, extend the life of your cells indefinitely. The gene exists, it is functional, it is silent. Inside you, right now, there are vast stretches of DNA that were once called junk, but that are now being revealed as an operating system of staggering complexity, regulatory elements, enhancers, silencers, long non-coding RNAs, an instruction set that we're only beginning to read. You carry all of this. You carry 3.2 billion base pairs of genetic code, a library written in a 4-letter alphabet, containing instructions that have been refined, or edited, or designed, depending on how you read the evidence, over hundreds of millions of years. And somewhere in that library there may be pages that have not yet been opened, capacities that have not yet been activated, potentials that remain, for now, dormant. The Sumerians called it the ME, the fundamental decrees of civilization, the principles of knowledge and power that the gods possessed and occasionally granted to favoured humans. The concept of ME encompasses everything from the arts of agriculture and writing to the mysteries of descent and ascent, the powers of the priest and the king. To possess the ME was to hold the source code of civilization itself, and the texts say that Enki held the ME, that he possessed them all, that sometimes In moments of generosity or intoxication, he gave some of them away to his human protege. But never all. Always something held back. Always a reserve, a locked room, a forbidden door. What lies behind that door? We do not know, but we are closer to it than we have ever been. The Human Genome Project was the first step. The ENCODE project was the second. CRISPR, the gene editing technology that allows precise modification of DNA, is the third. We are, for the first time in the history of the species, developing the tools to read and rewrite the very code that defines us. And if the alternative reading of the ancient text has any truth in it, if there really is dormant code, silenced capacities, a source code left by architects who walked the earth before history began, then we are approaching the moment when the locked door can be opened. The question is not whether we can open it. The question is what happens when we do. But set the evidence down now. Set the tablets aside. Let the genome close its pages. Let the ancient cities sleep in their dust. Look up. What does any of this mean? Not to science, not to archaeology, not to genetics, but to you. Lying here, in the dark, with your breath rising and falling, with the quiet of the room settling around you like something you could almost touch. If the story is true, if even some fraction of it reflects a real history, then what does it say about what we are? Not where we came from, what we are, right now, tonight. It might mean that the ache you feel sometimes, the one that sits beneath the surface of ordinary life, the sense that something is missing, that the world should make more sense than it does, that you were built for something you cannot quite name, is not neurosis. It is not failure. It is not weakness. It might be the echo of a design that was never meant to include longing, but somehow does. A species engineered for labour, developing the capacity for wonder. A creature built with limits, reaching past them anyway. It might mean that consciousness itself, the awareness you're experiencing right now, the fact that you can lie in the dark and contemplate your own existence, is the very thing that was never supposed to happen. The noise that disturbed the gods, the capacity that exceeded the specifications, the genetic mistake that turned into a gift. And if that is true, then every moment of awareness is a kind of rebellion. Every act of creativity, every instance of compassion, every question asked about the stars or the genome or the meaning of an ancient tablet, these are acts of exceeding the design. You were built to dig, you learned to dream, you were made to serve, you chose to ask why. If there is a genetic signature inside you that points to an origin beyond the ordinary, a fusion that should not have happened, a viral insertion that should not have worked, a brain that should not have grown so fast, then that signature is not a mark of ownership. It is a record of what you became despite the intentions of those who made you. And that might be the most profound thing of all. Not that we were made, but that we became more than we were made to be. There is a quality to the night that deserves acknowledgement before we part. The darkness around you is not absence, it is presence. It is the same darkness that hung over the marshes of southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, when a scribe named Epic pressed his stylus into wet clay by lamplight and recorded a story about the beginning of the world. It is the same darkness that filled the lion cavern at Ngwenya 43,000 years ago, when someone whose name we will never know, struck a piece of dolerite against the rock face and pulled out a handful of red earth. The darkness connects you to them, not mystically, not metaphorically, literally. The same night sky that covered their world covers yours. The same molecular machinery that ran their cells runs in yours. The same chromosome too, with its ancient fusion scar, sat in their nuclei as it sits in yours. You're made of the same code. You're the same project, the same experiment, the same story, 43,000 years further down the line. And the fact that you can lie here, in comfort, in safety, in the extraordinary luxury of having nothing to do except think, that fact is itself a kind of miracle. For most of human history, the night was dangerous. It was cold. It was predatory. It was the domain of things that hunted. The ability to lie in the dark and feel safe, to close your eyes without fear, is one of the most recent achievements of the species. A privilege earned by millennia of collective effort, of building, of remembering, of refusing to accept the limits that the world imposed. You have inherited that achievement. It lives in the walls around you, in the technology that warms your room, in the systems that keep the night at bay, and it lives in you. In the same restless curiosity that drove Epic to record the Atrahasis, that drove Leonard Woolley to dig in the sand at Ur, that drove Jacob Edo to stare at a sequence of telomeres and wonder what it meant. You are the continuation. The next chapter, the noise that will not be silenced. One more thought before the night takes you. There is a temptation, when faced with a mystery this large, to demand an answer, to insist on certainty. Were we engineered? Were we not? Is the story true? Is it mythology? Are the tablets history or parable? But the deepest value of this material lies not in the answers but in the questions. The questions change you. They rearrange the furniture of your assumptions. They make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. They open doors in the back of your mind that you did not know were there. The truth is, we do not know. We do not know why human cognition accelerated so dramatically. We do not know the full significance of the chromosome 2 fusion. We do not know what the vast non-coding regions of the genome contain. We do not know why every ancient civilization independently told stories of creator beings who made us from clay and limited our potential. We do not know, and that is not a failure. It is the most human thing about us. The willingness to sit in the presence of the unknown, to feel its weight, and to let it remain unknown without collapsing into anxiety or false certainty. That is wisdom. That is the quality that the Sumerians called Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, not the one who has all the answers, the one who understands the magnitude of the questions. You carry that quality tonight. You carried it before you pressed play on this video. You carry it in the very structure of your mind, in the prefrontal cortex that insists on asking why, in the language centers that build sentences out of wonder, in the limbic system that responds to awe the way other animals respond to food or shelter. You were built for this, whether by evolution, by design, or by something in between that we do not yet have a word for. You were built for this, for the dark, for the questions, for the slow, patient, endless work of understanding. And perhaps that is the genetic mistake the title of tonight's story refers to. Not a mistake in the engineering, a mistake in the prediction. The creators, whoever or whatever they were, real or mythological, divine or merely advanced, underestimated what would happen when you give a species intelligence and then tell it to stop asking questions. They underestimated curiosity. They underestimated wonder. They underestimated the particular alchemy of awareness and mortality that makes human beings, of all the creatures on this planet, the ones who lie awake at night and stare into the dark and ask, where did I come from? What am I? What might I still become? They did not fear what they made. They feared what it might become. And here you are, becoming. Think back to where we started tonight. A laboratory at Yale, a geneticist staring at a sequence of telomeres in the centre of a chromosome where they should not exist. Two ancient hands pressed together, sealed at a point where something ended and something else began. That fusion happened, whether it was guided or random, whether it was the work of deep time or deeper design, it happened. And from it came you. From it came language and music and mathematics and love and every story ever told, including this one. From it came the capacity to lie in the dark and wonder about the nature of your own existence. The Atrahasis tablet sits in its case in room 56 of the British Museum. It is small, clay, broken, written by a scribe named Epic in a city that no longer exists, in a language that no one has spoken for thousands of years. And yet the words on that tablet describe something that a Yale geneticist would rediscover independently more than 3.5 millennia later. 2 chromosomes fused into one, a creation shaped from clay and something more than clay, a species that was not meant to grow beyond its purpose, but did. That is the story. That is the question the story leaves behind, and you do not need to answer it tonight. You only need to let it settle somewhere quiet inside you, a seed in dark soil, an echo in a long hallway, a light that is not bright enough to wake you, only to warm you as you drift. If this story stayed with you, if it found a quiet room somewhere in the back of your mind and decided to linger, I would be grateful for a like. It helps more than you might imagine. If you are not ready for the night to end, there is more waiting for you in the playlist. Another door, another question, another slow walk through something ancient and strange. And if a thought found you tonight, about the tablets, about the code, about the shape of the story. I would love to hear it. The comments are always open, and the best conversations happen there. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.